Hi there, this is Philip from Beyond the Tabletop, and in this video I'm showing you how I'm building my Daemonhost model. Now I'm pretty sure the original Daemonhost model you can't actually buy anymore, and it looks quite dinky and small in comparison to how I imagine it, so I've been working on a reimagined version to go alongside my Inquisitor Greyhorn. Now I've already written some backstory for my Inquisitor Lady Greyhorn, and in that it talks about the summoning of the demon Essossas and turning him into a demon host. So I already had a rough idea of what I wanted my demon host to look like, someone that was quite strong and muscular, because the original host was a prisoner who was in a very fit condition. The original starting off point for my model was the old rogue psyker model from Forgeworld, which is now part of the Necromunda range, and I cut that up and I started using it, but the scale of everything that I wanted just didn't work. As you can see, I've already built part of a demon host. I've got the base model all down, so you can see the head, the torso and the legs, and he's done in a upwards sort of flying pose to show his power, sort of summoning him up into the air. Now, like my previous videos, I just want to show you different steps so it's not cluttering in the way of too much of this project because it's quite complicated. So instead I'm just going to talk you through what I've done at each section rather than a complete step-by-step sort of time-lapse of this video. So I've done the model in that classic demon host pose where he's flying up in the air with his arms outstretched. And I always knew that's roughly what I wanted him to look like. So let me talk you through the model. The head is from the Dark Apostle set, so he's a Chaos Space Marine. I had to cut away a lot of the extra armour that was built around the neck just to make that work. So it's a matter of just posing the head, cutting it so it was tilted backwards slightly, and then gluing it in place with plastic glue. And then I could just use some green stuff to rebuild in some of those sort of neck muscles just to join it all up together. And then the torso is one of the models from the Garrix Reaver's Warband, who's part of the Shadespire range. And then I just made sure I cut off the original arms and heads and then cut off the torso at that belt, making sure to keep that belt line because that would be a good transition for the lower half of his body. And then these gauntlets, which were originally intended to be leather, are going to be painted up metallic because they're going to be part of his bindings. The next thing I worked on was the legs. So the leg piece is the Yinkan model, which is part of the Yunari range. So his legs were relatively suitably posed in terms of one of his legs was going downwards and, you know, ideally, potentially the other leg going downwards in a similar pose would have been ideal, but to me it just felt like it was too much work to try and completely repose it. Now originally the leg seemed quite long, so I actually cut out a whole section of leg just above the knee and then reattached the knee in place just to shorten it up and make it look a bit more realistic. And in doing that, that actually seemed to make the leg look a bit more natural, but also bizarrely match up with the size of the other leg on the right hand side. So I think the sculptor had originally artificially lengthened this leg just to give it a bit more of an unnatural demonic pose. But as the demon host is a lot more human than the avatar, it made sense to give him more human proportions. So before I glued these two parts of the leg together and glued it to the model, I had to trim off all the detail from that model. You can see here where I've just maybe used a knife and I've trimmed away all of that elder runic detail that was on the model. So I used a combination of my knife, some files and some emery boards to sort of smooth the overall leg structures out. But then the legs were too skinny, so I then had to build up a whole load of muscle. So there were some muscles still on the model that I could just build onto, but to make it more realistic I actually used some reference photos of Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the 90s just to understand how the muscles look on a hyper muscular person. So in doing so I could get some reasonable good muscle definition and sculpt it out of green stuff, just using my standard metal sculpting tool to get the base shape down, and then using a couple of silicone tipped brushes just so we get a nice smooth finish. I then let that set for a day, so with that green stuff all dried I decided to add on some more demonic features by just sculpting in a couple of horns growing out the back of the ankle. So to do that I just rolled out some green stuff and shaped it to a point to create the horn, and then I just cut it off and I set that aside to dry, and then once it had dried I could then glue it onto the heel, and then I could use a small bit of green stuff all the way around that horn, which I could then sculpt into that skin growing around the horn. And then I just did the exact same process with the other one. So I thought that was just a nice little detail just to tie in the lower half of the model with the top half with the horns growing out of his head. Once those two pieces had dried, I could glue the legs together, and then I could glue the legs to the body, and then I could also add in the hands. So the hands are from the Necromunda Goliath upgrade pack, which came from Forgeworld, and I chose that one specifically because there was a set of open hands, so I could just carefully cut them out and pin the hands to the wrist. When it came to gluing the legs to the torso, I made sure to pin that in place so I had a decent support. So using super glue for the pin section of those two parts being glued together, but then using plastic glue for the surrounding parts to make sure that they were bonded together really well. When it came to pinning the hand to the wrist, I made sure I used super glue for all of that because resin can't use plastic glue, and then I just tidied it all up with green stuff and then filled in some extra bits of detail around here and around the bum area just because there was quite a large gap in there. However, a lot of these bits here, so around the crotch and the bum, I'll cover up with a bit of cloth, just so he's somewhat modest, but also that will tie in with some of the original Daemonhost artwork as well. So there's still a lot more detail that I want to add to this body. In terms of the detail, I've got this kind of, the corn symbol scarred into his body, which I'm just going to paint up so it's just like an old scar, whereas the chaos star that's on his forehead, I'll probably paint that to be glowing. Now, I was originally thinking about scoring into the body loads of sort of runic symbols, but I don't think I could do it justice with a knife, so what I'm going to do is save those symbols for the painting stage, and I'm going to use some transfers for those, which will either represent tattoos or markings on the body. So the next step is to add some bandages all around the body, as well as some cloth, in addition to some chains and some nails being driven into the body. So I've now gone away and added a ton of detail to the model. So I'm going to talk you through step by step all the little bits that I've done to get to this stage. So I started off with the Daemonhost bindings. Now you can see the white bandings here, and for this I decided to use actual paper rather than green stuff. I think green stuff would be a bit too thick, whereas here it will be nice and subtle and it will give me a nice edge to work on when I'm painting the model up. So for this I use the same product that I've used on a couple of my videos now, which is the VMS Wufu modelling paper. It's basically super thin paper which you can cut up and apply just using PVA glue. So for this I created just lots of tiny strips, applied PVA glue to those strips, and then I just carefully wrapped it around the model, starting off with just one leg and then working my way around to the other, and then also doing a few bits of bandings on the arm as well. In terms of creating the detail, I used one famous illustration from the old Inquisitor book, so I used that as a reference point and a guide just for the overall positioning. I also wanted to keep some areas quite plain because I knew I would want to add in some kind of tattoos using some transfers that I've got. In terms of attaching the bandages, I just used PVA glue, and then once those sections had dried, I applied PVA glue again on top of it just to secure it all down in place. I had one piece of bandage just trailing off the model, and to stiffen that piece up I just applied several coats of PVA glue. Now I had done a similar thing on this side that was just hanging down here, but ultimately it clashed when I added on the scroll, so I decided to take it off. Now I'm still tempted to add a few more bits of banding just dangling down off the model because I think it would give it a lot of visual movement to the model, which would look really good, but I've not decided about that yet, so I might add that on at the very end. Then I decided to have not just the bindings, but I also wanted some physical straps on the model, so I decided to do that on the arm. So for that I just folded over and glued down the Wufu paper so it was twice as thick, and then I created the little strap around the arm, and then using an etching tool I could just push in and create these little puncture holes similar to the holes that you get on your belt. And then for this piece of the strap hanging down, I just again folded it so it was extra thick, cut the end to a taper, and then glued that piece on and just applied lots of PVA glue so it was nice and secure. And then once that was all dried, I just carefully green stuffed a little belt buckle, pretty much just using a toothpick to help me sculpt on that detail. Then with that done, I decided to add in some studs around his waist. So if you look on the back of the model, you can see there was a couple of studs around the belt, and basically I decided to replicate that on the front just to make sure that detail was going all the way around. So these tiny rivets here come from a Brita water filter. I've talked about them in a few videos now, I'm pretty sure. So it was just a matter of breaking open a filter, finding these little beads that were all of a similar size, and just drilling out a hole that I could recess them in and just gluing them in place. Now when it comes to the chain wrapped around his torso, I've just used some fine hobby chain. So you can buy this from a bunch of different suppliers. Originally I picked some up from Green Stuff World, but their chain is actually far too big for this kind of scale. It's perfectly fine for things like vehicles. Now for this chain you need to either look at fine jeweler's chain or use scale model chain. Now for this chain in particular I got mine via eBay, but you can also get them from any kind of scale model shop that deals with scale model trains, because this is where you tend to find that chain in particular. So this one here is ultra fine brass chain. It's 0.5mm by 1.45mm. So that's the particular link dimensions. So if you put that into Google, I'm sure you'll come up with something similar. And there are a variety of sizes around that size, so you could probably get a bunch. So just have a look around online and see what you can find. Now the next thing I did was add in the nails. This is probably something I should have done right at the very end, because I did manage to break some off while handling the model, so I do need to be very careful with this. For the nails you can see they've been dug into the body all the way around. Now to create the nails I've got some styrene rod from Evergreen. It's 0.5mm in diameter. So I just needed to cut some to length. Now rather than just use a piece of rod and just insert it in, I wanted to create the nail head detail as well, which you can just see here. So to do that I took my knife and I heated it up using a Zippo lighter, and then when this was suitably hot I could just press the rod against the flat of the blade, which would just squish it because it would instantly melt the rod, just to create that nail effect. And with that done, I could then just drill out a hole within his body and put the rod in. Now initially I used some Tamiya extra thin cement because I thought that would glue it in place and hold it securely. And as I mentioned earlier, as I was handling the model, I did accidentally bend a few. Now that could be because I was being a bit careless, but it could actually be the plastic glue had actually weakened the rod itself, so it just wasn't as strong as it should be. So those ones that I replaced, I actually used super glue instead, which would hopefully give it a stronger bond to the model without weakening the integrity of the plastic, because the plastic isn't melting. So I've done that in a variety of places around the model, again just keeping it up in the torso. So the torso is predominantly the chains and the nails, while the legs are predominantly the bindings. The next step was to add a scroll which will cover his groin area as well as his bum. So on a practical level it just covers his modesty, but in a lore point of view this is going to be the scroll of binding, so it's going to have lots of runic symbols all over it. So this was my first attempt at kind of making flowing cloth. To do this I mixed some green stuff with some milliput. It was about 3 parts green stuff to 1 part milliput, and this just gives you a much softer material to work with. Then I put the green stuff within a small plastic bag that I could then roll out and flatten till it was nice and thin, and I just let that cure for about half an hour so it was a bit easier to work with. And then I just cut it to shape and started adding it to the model, adding in a lot of the recesses and folds as I went. And then once I was happy I let it fully set for over a day. So once that initial one was down I could then do the same on the back, doing just a much smaller cloth this time and having some kind of dramatic flow, because obviously he's flying up in the air, so I want to get some real motion in the cloth. Then once this had both set for a day I could then go back in with some fresh green stuff just to iron out some of the creases that I had in there, just to smooth it out a bit more and just to add in some extra folds and detail just to make it a little bit more realistic. So I also especially worked on this section here, just reshaping it, just filling out some of the detail at the very top just so it was a bit thicker, and then again just on here making sure all of those folds looked a bit more realistic. And then again I just let that cure for another day. Then there was just a few last bits of detail to add in. The first are the locks that appear on his chain at the front and on the back just here. So these bits of detail actually come from Inquisitor Eisenhorn, which you can see just here. All I did was make a press mould out of some blue stuff, which you can see just here, and basically I then filled that with green stuff and let that set for a day. When it comes to adding in the lock, I basically cut the very top part of that little lock off. So what I could do is I could glue that lock on over those links, and then using a tiny bit of green stuff I could basically sculpt over the top into that link so it looked like the padlock is actually going through the chains. And then I just had to repeat that same process on the back one, so it looks like those chains are locked together rather than the padlock just being resting on top of those chains. So it's a little bit extra effort, but that subtle bit of detail really does make all the difference. Lastly, I wanted a holy relic being bound to him as well, which you can see just down here, again made of green stuff. And if we look here, you can actually see I've taken it again from Eisenhorn from his Imperial Rosette. So again, I just made another press mould, I glued that in place, then I just took some cotton thread that I had lying around and wrapped that around his leg a few times, holding it in place with some PVA glue, and then just painting some PVA glue on top to hopefully set all the loose threads down and secure that rope in place. So that is the demon host complete. I've added 2 holes just here and here, which is where more chains are going to come down, and they will be trailing down to the base of the model. He's actually going to be floating up in the air ever so slightly, and to create that illusion I've used a few books from the Grey Knight sets and I've stacked them up together, pinning the foot to this book and then pinning this book to this book, and lastly will be pinned in place to the base. You can also see I've recreated some of the papers just using green stuff along this book, just to add in some extra detail there, just because it didn't look very realistic on the original model. So that's essentially how he's going to be held in place, and as you can see here, he'll be sort of flying up in the air. The next stage is to look at how I'm going to secure him to the model, which I'll show you once that's completed. I've now completed the model where I'm really happy with it and it's all ready for painting. In the end, I didn't add any of the extra bindings on the model that I thought I might. I sort of figured it might be a bit overkill and the model looks pretty good as it is. So you can see that I've now completely based the model, mounting the books and pinning them onto the bottom of the base, and then you can see the wire just going here, gluing it in place using my kind of new method, which is bending the bit of wire around and then using baby powder and super glue mixed together to create a nice thick paste, and setting that rod in place, and then using some glue on this side as well just to secure it all in place. In the end, I still use the core base element of the avatar base, which was this large piece, and at one point I was thinking about having the large avatar swirl going around behind him, but I decided against that because it seemed to clutter the silhouette of the model up too much. But what I did do is I carefully cut out from the swirl some of the extra bits of the rubble that form part of the summoning circle, and I just then placed those on in a few places just so it looks like it's been recently shattered. Now, to flesh out the base, once I'd put those rubble pieces down, I used the Stirland texture mud, which is what I use for all my Krieg bases. So I just heavily applied that all over the base, filling in any gaps so it looks like it's on a muddy ruined terrain, and then this kind of summoning circle is part of a building that was once here on top. And then just adding in that texture all over so it will tie in really visually with the other bases that I've done for my Inquisition, where they have broken stone elements on their bases. Now the grit in the Stirland texture mud is a bit more grainy and a bit more visible than the finer baby powder bases that I've done for my other Inquisition models. So what I decided to do was add in a few patches of the baby powder mixed with super glue, which you can just see sort of here and here and here, and dotted around in a few places, just to again visually tie it with those other bases. So I have some elements where the grain is a bit finer than just the Sterling texture mod on its own. Then when it comes to creating the chain, I used my slightly thicker chain that I've got. As you can see, it's similar to the one on the body, but it's just a larger size. So this is 1.1 millimeters by 1.9 millimeters, and that's the size of each individual link. So if you were to search for that online on places like eBay or just on Google, I'm sure you'll come up with some modelling shops that will sell that size. So I decided to mount that on some weights, and the two weights here that I've got, which come from the Rogue Psyker models, which are weighing them down. So I just cut those pieces off, and then I just basically crimped down one of the link chains until it formed a pin, which I could then just add into a hole that I had drilled out on the weight. And then I glued that in place, and then I'd done the exact same thing, mounting the top of the chain into that armband. And then I had basically glued these in a position that I was quite comfortable with, and then the chain was just dangling down loose. So what I did is I used some super glue that is super thin, and I applied it to the very top and let it just drip down all the way along the bottom, which would set it in place. So the glue I used was Rocket Hot. It says it's super thin penetrating, which is really good because it just flows literally everywhere. So you've got to be quite careful with it in that respect, because it could go everywhere, and what would happen is it would quite often pool up in the individual links. So what I did is I just blew onto those links, so it would just remove the tension from the glue, so it wouldn't glue in a solid piece. Now be careful, because when you do that you'll be literally blowing small specks of glue all over the place, so just be careful what's behind the model, or just make sure you're blowing down onto your surface here, because otherwise you could get it all over the place. Now I did that about 3 times just to make sure that these are super secure. Now the second and third time I had lightly dusted on some baby powder before applying the glue, which just helps give the bond a bit of extra thickness, but will also help create a slightly rusted effect on the model, which I will then enhance later on when it comes to painting. So with that all glued down, there was just a few extra bits of detail that I added in. So I had a few extra books from the Grey Knight range, so I added one at the front that was open with the Purity seal, and then there was another larger one at the back, which I'd got second hand from a friend, which is why it's painted black basically. And then the last bits of detail were adding in some skulls from the GW skull kit. I did think about having one in each corner, so I'd have 4 in total, and I even thought about having 8, so 1 for each point on the Chaos Star, but I figured that would actually be just too overwhelming, so I decided against that. Then for the last step I just added in some candles, which is again an extra detail which ties it in with the Assassin's base that I've been working on. Now to make these you just need some styrene tubing, some brass or copper wire, and then some PVA glue that you mix with baby powder to create that effect. Now I've already done a full in-depth tutorial, so rather than go into detail here, I'll just link it in the top right hand corner now for you to check out. So that is the finished model, and he is all ready for painting. He is quite steady just on his own, so I can just pick him up from his head for example, or from his arms, without worrying about him coming away, because he is ultimately pinned in place via his foot to the books and those books to the base. Now I guess there is some extra support from the chains, but the chains aren't really holding up the model. That is just a decorative element that is in there. But I gave a nice kind of trail effect on those chains, so it looks like he is being lifted up and dragging those chains behind him. Ultimately, I'm really happy with how this model looks. Now in terms of figures, it's probably the most complex conversion project that I've done. Obviously I've done some other quite complex conversion projects, but they tend to be with tanks. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this guy looks once he is all painted up and added to my army. So that's all for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Keep an eye out for the other videos in this series. I've already done one on my Inquisitor Lady Eleanor Greyhorn, and then the Acolytes, and there'll be another video on my Astra Militarum Crusaders. If you want to support the channel, you can back me over on Patreon or use my Element Games affiliate link. You can find those down in the description below. You can also check out my online store, beyondthetabletop.com/shop, where I sell resin conversion kits for both infantry and vehicles.
Thanks again for watching this video. Feel free to hit all the usual YouTube buttons to like and subscribe, or follow my other social media platforms for regular updates with what I'm working on. That's all for now. Until the next time, take care.